Hello witches, and welcome back to Activist Witch, where we discuss witchcraft and activism. You can call me Isha, my pronouns are she, they, and today's video is going to be about my ancestor practice and how it's going so far and where I hope that it's going to go. But before we get started, let me remind you that I've opened a Ko-fi, which is an alternative to Patreon that takes less from creators. And on there you can do a one-off donation, a monthly donation, or even buy a tarot reading with me Italian style. The low-income option starts at £5. And if you decide to support me there, thank you so very much. So today's video was voted for by you, and it's part of my commitment to do 50-50 content, 50% witchcraft, 50% activism, because I do tend a bit more towards activism. And if you've seen my video about shame, you kind of know why. I know that there are many more witches talking about properly witchy stuff, ancestor work included. This is just my experience, and it's a bit of a story time, really. So here I'm sharing my own practice and experience. Credit where it's due, I think I've thought to give this even as an option to my audience to vote for, because that's how I make videos, by the way, because I've seen a couple of videos by Frankie Castanea, the Chaotic Witch Aunt, and they were talking about their own connection to their own ancestors. They are an Italian-American practitioner, so it was really interesting. I left a couple of comments because I found that their points of discussion were very interesting. And then I realized that I have never made a video talking about my own practice, so here we go. First things first, I think I started to even think about ancestor work a few months into my current practice, which just started like 18 months ago, because for Christmas of 2022, I was gifted Ancestral Tarot by Nancy Hendrickson, and I'm a very slow reader, I have dyslexia. Thankfully, that was for Kindle. On Kindle, I can read white on black, which really works well for me. I devoured that book and I managed to read it in 4 or 5 days. By New Year's, I had read it. There are a few spreads there on how to start connecting with your ancestors. At the time, clearly, it wasn't the time, because every kind of thing or spread that I tried to do was just like, no, 10 of Swords, and no, don't do this now, don't do this now. And so I put a pin in it, so to speak. My first connection and thought for ancestor work, it's my maternal grandparents, because they actually raised me. They passed away a long, long time ago now, but I've always had this connection with them. Something peculiar that has always happened is that the few times that I've dreamt about my grandmother, in the dreams I could never realize that she was actually dead. Like, it was very obvious to me that I was seeing her and talking to her, because of course you're around. My grandfather, I can't say that I think I ever dreamt about him. He passed away first, so I was really, really small. And in the years, I've sort of regretted the way that I treated him. He was the only male figure in my life, really. And I guess there was a slight kind of fear of that kind of authority. Otherwise, my family was very accidentally matriarchal. It was my mother, it was my grandmother. It happened to be my grandfather, my nonno as well. But all the siblings of my grandmother were women as well. So I've been mainly around women and femmes. And so my grandfather was my main male figure. And I guess between the fact that he was very introverted in a way, and in hindsight I understand, because he had his son in cancer. I don't think people would have thought of him as an emotional person, but he was definitely very introverted, and it does make me wonder if it was actually because he had all these emotions, but for someone being born at the beginning of the 1900s, it just probably didn't have the language to express that. However, something that was always made clear, and as a child I didn't take too much attention to it, it was just the default, it was just normal. Everybody was pointing out how the sentimental side of my grandfather had come out with me. He had this absolute adoring love for me. And I remember my mother telling stories about, the natural disappointment that her father, my grandfather, had in the fact that I was a girl rather than a boy, because always enormous air quotes on girl and boy. But, I was AFAB, I was assigned female at birth. And supposedly, you know, when you want to pass down your name, that's not ideal. So it was considered even more, I guess, the fact that he loved me and adored me so much. In hindsight, as I mentioned vaguely here and there, my mother is a very problematic person. She has narcissistic personality disorder, and she has always told different stories to different people to pass as the victim. So in hindsight, I don't think that my grandfather necessarily cared about my gender. It was just one of those things that my mother would say around so that people could pity her. The main story of my grandparents that you might have heard me mention here and there, but since this is a video about ancestors, I should mention, is that legend has it that the day I was born, they didn't come to visit me at the hospital, which apparently was a great offense in Italian culture. Your first grandchild is born and you don't go see them at the hospital. And my mother's story repeated that it was because I was mixed race. My mother married a man from Egypt, and so I was the only person of color in my village. I was the only baby that was non-white in my nursery, and supposedly my grandparents didn't bother coming the first day. They came the second day, and then apparently the comment that my grandmother brought was, oh, don't you see how all the other babies are more beautiful because they're all white, they are all with blue eyes. I was born very dark, with a full head of dark curls. As a child, I was unmistakably non-white. I know that nowadays I somewhat pass. I didn't up until I was sort of a teenager, at the very least, maybe a little bit later as well. That is one of the sub-stories that my mother tells. However, through my ancestor work, I think I might have figured out that was actually not the case. I've always had the pictures of my grandparents around. I have objects that belonged to them, and I've had them with me for quite a few years. One of the main things that I carried with me since I left home was my grandfather's pocket watch. And a few years ago, in the old room of my grandparents, the engagement ring of my grandmother was found, which I had never seen, even as a child. And that was amazing for me. So thankfully, at the time, I was still visiting Italy. So when I went to Italy, I had a chance to get it. And so those two items are the most important items that I own, really. One is for my grandmother, one is for my grandfather. I carry them with me always. It's my most treasured possession, and I wore them both at my wedding because I want them to be with me. But before starting to practice witchcraft, I had never thought or known about anything that wasn't just ancestral veneration, really. As you can imagine, being born and raised in Italy, we were Catholics, although, and I must say this, at the very least in my village, we were Catholics by default, but because my village is extremely small, it's like 600 people, farmers for generations, folk traditions that are rooted or pretend to be rooted in Catholicism are a thing. But we are not that strict about Catholicism, really. I remember when I lived in Ireland, Ireland takes their Catholicism very seriously. We really don't. I'm not saying in Italy in general, but definitely not in my village. That's to explain, like, it's not like my grandparents were particularly religious. There's the standard of going to Mass. There's the kind of rituals that the village went through. I don't know, on All Saints' Day, on the 1st of November, everybody shows up at the cemetery to honor their dead. But that's because those are rituals of the community rather than religious things, really. So step by step, how did I start my ancestral work rather than just worship and remembering? I think the first thing that happened was about this time last year. I was working as a freelance in a nearby town, Swansea. And just down the road from where I was working in a theatre, there was a witchy shop that witchy shop had a tarot reader every Saturday. That Saturday actually was the last day that I was working there, and so I had time in the afternoon. I booked a tarot reading. I went to have my tarot read. At the time I was already reading for myself, but I was really curious to see how it worked with someone else reading my cards. And for all I knew, it was going to be a tarot reading. I show up, I sit in front of this lady that is reading my tarot. Before she reads anything, she just tells me that there's this woman with me that looks a certain way. And the certain way was very obviously my grandmother. I wasn't ready for that. Like, it wasn't advertised as a psychic reading. It was just a tarot reading for all I knew. So that freaked me out a tiny bit. I think I have notes here and there. I don't remember the entire thing. It was absolutely shocking and devastating. I don't know, maybe I should do a video just about that experience. I'm also thinking about going back to Swansea, and because it's been a year, to basically have a reading with her again and see what's up. The main thing that stuck with me from that one was that my grandmother apparently lamented through her that I need to stop eating things from the packet. Now, that is not the kind of information that a psychic reader, a tarot reader, even if they had researched me, would have. I'm bigger, I'm fat, I'm a plus-sized person. So I would understand the assumption of thinking, oh, maybe you eat a lot of takeaways. That I would have, discarded as, oh yeah, it's the assumption because you read the purse, so you don't read the cards. But saying that my grandmother lamented me eating out of a packet, eating stuff directly from a packet, was a bit more problematic. Because, indeed, it is something that I do. I have a relatively limited diet. Something that I usually reach for is packets of sliced cheese with packets of cured meats. And usually then I put the meats in the cheese, I do a roll, and I eat that. That's my standard snack. So for this person to say, your grandmother wants you to cook more because you eat out of a packet, it was a bit freaky. So after that, I already had the pictures out. They weren't as prominent. I think after that, I considered at least to consecrate a tarot deck to try and speak with my ancestors. I don't use it very often. I don't use it often enough. I think because at times I'm scared. What are you scared of, Isha? This is important stuff for me. If you were to ask me why do you practice witchcraft, at the bottom, the cornerstone of it, it would be to know that we are not just human beings tied to material and physics. So if I manage to speak with my grandparents, if I manage to speak with my deities, my outlook on life changes crucially. And because I suffer from thanatophobia, that would bring a renewed quality of life, despite the fact that I would still have to accept we die. So speaking to people that are technically dead would kind of do that, would very much help. To be fair, it goes further back, like in the first 2-3 weeks that I started to practice, so September 2022. You get into witchcraft, you start to look around things, what do people do? What do people have on their altars? And one of the things that I stumbled upon was indeed tools, altar tools, the kind of stuff that people go and buy because that way they feel like witches. We'll soon do the video on capitalism, I promise. But yeah, that's the thing. I almost kinda fell victim of that as well, in a peculiar way. I was looking up wands, but I didn't necessarily have a plan or an interest until I find this wand. It's from a lady that makes them in the Isle of Wight. It's made of hazel, and it's short and stubby. It's not the kind of elongated standard wand. It's actually short and stubby. It's a bit stocky in its own way. And it's made of hazel. Now, I don't know why, but the moment that I saw this wand, it reminded me of my grandmother. Probably because short and stocky as well, but also because something that connects me to my grandmother, to my very early memories with her, was that in the backyard of our house in the countryside, we would usually go to pick up hazel nuts. Because the neighbor had an hazel tree just on the border before their fence. So we didn't quite have the hazel tree, but if we went to the backyard when the hazelnuts would fall, we would have hazelnuts. And going to the backyard to gather hazels with her it's one of the most prominent memories for me. And then we would go home and then we would discern if they have a little hold on it and da-da-da-da. So I see this small, short, stubby wand, and I get it, and I dedicate it to my grandmother. She works like a charm. And in time then, I had one made for Raven. There's another specific plant that I connect to that is related to my grandparents, and it's poplar, which I think is also aspen, but specifically black poplar. That's because my grandparents were farmers. One of the many kind of fields that they would grow on a longer term basis were poplars. You would plant them and you would have them there for like 10 years and then you would sell the wood. That's because it's a very good wood, it's very dense. Poplars are very common where I come from. They are planted for sale, basically for selling. And they have a very specific scent, especially when they bloom in early summer. So when I explained this to Raven, then Raven was like, I'd like a wand made of that. I commissioned that, and the lady that did the first wand accidentally had 2 pieces of poplar after I asked her. And the second one was much more elongated, a bit wonky, and I don't know, probably because the first one reminded me of my grandmother, this one reminded me of my grandfather. So I was like, actually, do the main one that you found for my wife, but I'll have the wonky bit as well, because that reminds me of my grandfather, I'll dedicate it to them. So that's actually something that started immediately as I started my practice. So I think in the back of my head, it was immediately like, as a witch, aren't I supposed to connect with people that are beyond the veil? Even if I don't have the clearest idea as to, do we die and reincarnate? Do we die and hang around? Do we die and merge with some bigger conscious? I don't know. Technically, my preferred belief is reincarnation, but then how do you explain? Hey, if you have an idea, leave me a comment, okay? Stay, Stelina, stay. I need to check the time. My first actual work with my grandparents didn't happen until I actually had just started this channel. So, Samhain of 2023, Halloween. I made an entire video about that specific experience, so I'll just link to that. In short, I did a prosperity spell, and my grandfather was very focused on material stuff. He wasn't a hoarder, like my mother is a hoarder, he really wasn't. But because of, I imagine generational trauma, like in my village, most people are farmers for generations, and it's not a great life. My grandparents had it slightly better because there was World War II, there was a lot of money invested, there was a lot of rights that were given to farmers in the 70s, because in the 70s, Italy had the biggest communist party out of Russia, so a lot of workers' rights come from that. So for the time that they were farmers, they were actually able to buy their own land and then work their own land and put something aside. It wasn't much, but it was an absolute change of life for them. They were the first generation that could ever do that. And so, because of where he came from, he was really attached. It was very important to keep what was put aside. In a way, I associate the King of Pentacles as a tarot card with him, because he wasn't greedy at all, but he was very careful about how can I take care of my family, how can I make them safe enough. Something that he used to do that actually came back to me through one of these meditations. Like, it's a memory that I haven't accessed in probably over 3 decades, actually. And I was very small. I must have been like 3 years old. He would take me to the bank, and he was treated with a lot of respect around there. And he would introduce me as, this is the hair. Everything we do is for her. Which also should have suggested me that they knew something about my mother that at the time, as a child, I didn't. But yeah, like, in their head, they were skipping a generation. And unfortunately, it took me a long time to understand why, because they passed away too soon. I think they had plans to keep me safe from her the way that they could, the way that they understood. But unfortunately, they passed away when I wasn't legally an adult. And so there's only so much that they could do to protect me. And we don't go there. It's fine. The interesting thing was that after that meditation, I took notes of things. Something that Raven made me notice is that when I go in these places, and everything sounds obvious, I see things. The main thing is that I see things. Tendentially, I see places, actually. And then if there's something to reason from that, comes to me. But because of that, it always feels like I'm making this up. Something interesting that I still think I might make up, but they're like, I don't think you would, is this thing. So in that first meditation, I asked my grandfather to join me and help me with a prosperity spell. And one of the things that occurred to me was make a sigil with the letters of my surname. It was a 5-letter surname. It was doable. I didn't even cut out the vowels. In the moment, it's really present, of course, like, it's just a thought that comes to you. But the moment that I open my eyes, everything is starting to fade away quickly, like it happens with a dream. So I screamed to Raven to bring me pen and paper. And I draw this sigil, and then I try to go back under. And I remember trying to ask, or trying to think, well, I'll put this sigil in my money ball. And what I heard was like, what's this nonsense with money balls? We have wallets. Wallets is what we use for money. You put it in the wallet. And it's fair. Money balls are not something that exists in my culture. We don't have the bowl in which you put change. Like, we lived off of change. Everything was measured to the penny. So you don't just have a bowl of money around that is not in your wallet to be used. Or it's in the bank. So it was a very interesting scolding. Like, no, what's this nonsense with money balls? We have wallets. We use wallets. You put it in the wallet. And I don't know. Raven was like, why do you think you would scold yourself that way if it wasn't your grandfather? That's interesting, isn't it? So something that I've done recently is put together all my meditation, everything that I consider a sign somewhat in its own meditation journal. And other than having the meditation with my grandfather and all the details, apparently a month later I tried to do another one, which I don't remember at all. Like, I only know because I wrote it down. And in this second one, not only saw my grandfather, I saw the cemetery of my village, which is where my grandfather is buried. And I saw the cemetery in the first meditation as well. This time, the part of the cemetery that I saw was a corner that, again, I probably haven't been to in over 30 years. But it's where I knew my great-grandmother, so my grandfather's mother, was buried. So in a way, my grandfather took me to her, to meet her. I have a picture of her, actually. She passed away before my mother was even born, so I know next to nothing about her. I know her name. And actually, that's the meditation where I remembered how he was taking me to the bank and introducing me to people. So the interesting thing there was that I thought information, technically verifiable information about my great-grandmother. It's just very hard to get in touch with my village council and convince them to go into archives to tell me if it's true. But according to that, yeah, my great-grandmother had 4 siblings, possibly including her, so they were 4 siblings. 1 sister and 1 brother, so I don't know what the third one was. And they had been in my village for 6 generations. I don't know where the 6 come from. The suggestion was that she died of TBC, of tuberculosis consumption. I don't know that. Again, it's not, she was never talked about because she passed away so long ago. I wish that I could verify that. Again, I've tried, but my village is not amazing at getting back to you. Something insanely peculiar from that meditation. My main aim was actually to connect to my grandmother there, my nonna. I love her in ways that I cannot explain. I think she's actually the true inspiration of the kind of human that I want to be. Every kind of person that I've looked up to has some of her quiet, peaceful decency. Time and time again in my head, since starting to practice, I've had this thought in my head that my grandmother, because she didn't want to marry, she had to marry. For her time, she married really late. Her first child she had when she was 34, which is insane in the 40s. But I keep having this thought that could my grandmother have been either asexual or a lesbian, and maybe that's why she didn't want to marry, because none of that made sense to her. She begged her parents to keep her just working with them in the fields. She would have paid rent to her parents to stay there, but they didn't allow her, and so she had to marry. I think she was the last sister to marry. The thing that I learned most recently, and most recently I'm talking about 7 or 8 years ago, about my great-grandparents on my grandmother's side, was through my great-aunt, which I think when I met her last time, she was like 92. She was the youngest sister. And at the time, I'd already understood that it's very important to keep informations of your previous generations alive. As a child, you don't realize, but once you get to proper adulthood, you realize how important it is to keep the memory alive. And so I asked her about my great-grandparents. Apparently, talking about the past is really upsetting to her, so she didn't say much, unfortunately. One thing was that I learned that my grandmother was actually named after my great-great-grandmother, so the mother of her father. Rightfully, she was the first child, usually the first child. If it's a boy, you name it after the father. If it's a girl, you name it after the mother of the father. Always this patriarchal priority, but anyway. So the second thing that I learned from my great-aunt was that actually my great-grandfather was violent to his family. He was beating his daughters, he was beating my great-grandmother. He used to drink, so that's, I don't know, the excuse, I guess, that they had. And I found this picture when I cleared the house of my grandparents. And nothing in this picture tells me that it's actually my great-grandparents. And it's clearly from the early 1900s, probably 1910s, tops. It would kind of make sense because they would be 20, 25 years old. They were both born at the end of the 1800s. There's just something in their expression that suggests to me it could be them. And looking at the bride, which would be my great-grandmother, you can see this sad resignation. And don't get me wrong, there's something boastful about him, about the groom. I don't know, I have this feeling that it's actually them, so that's why I saved this picture. There was no information on this picture. I've never met my great-grandparents, And that's actually one of the things. My great-grandmother passed away 4 years before I was born. My mother apparently was quite close to her. You know, your grandmother, when you're raised as a girl, can be quite a thing of connection. Legend has it that my grandmother couldn't fall pregnant. She had me very, very late, in quite old age as well. My family really was late bloomers, and I'm not going to have children at all, so yeah. But one of the stories she tells is that she prayed to her grandmother to fall pregnant, and within the week that she prayed is the date where I was conceived. I vaguely remember that. In the second meditation, where I am again in the cemetery of my village, where all generations of my maternal line are buried, I also see the place where my great-grandmother is buried, which in my first meditation on Samhain, I saw was also the place where my grandmother was, even though she's buried somewhere different. So in my head it was my grandmother went back to be with her own mother. Anyway, I spoke, asked her, and then actually I see the house of my great aunt, which I discovered later is actually the house of my great-grandparents. Like, that's where my grandmother was also born. For very shady stuff, the entire house of my great-grandparents passed on to the youngest daughter alone. Fine, let's not go there. So I see my great-grandmother there, and she tells me, apparently, she tells me that, yes, it is true that she's the reason I was born. And she's sorry, I wrote in Italian, so I have to translate. She's sorry for the troubles that making me come to life have brought to me. But she knew that I would have made it, and that I was strong, and that I could make something of myself because I was coming from nothing, meaning that, and that is also true, like the entirety of my family, my village, never grew past the village. I don't think there's anyone from my village that has actually left the village or, you know, the closest city. And basically the thoughts put down was like, you know, your cousins, you're different. You didn't have the same relation and connection to the land, probably because, you know, I'm half white, probably because, again, they own the house that was of my great-grandparents, and I own nothing. But the point was basically made of coming from nothing, you had the chance to grow past the limitations of our village. So I'm sorry that I brought you to life. So in a way, maybe she answered the prayer of my mother. I'm sorry for the trouble that brought to you. But I knew that you could make it, and you could make more of yourself than anyone else has done. They are also very much stuck in the same thing. They are what they are for generations. So they have been farmers for generations, they have been surveyors for generations. Basically what she said to me was, I didn't want you to get stuck without a choice, and having nothing means that you could get anything. I don't know what kind of thought is that. I don't know if it's a consolation that I tell myself. But it's interesting, isn't it? There's actually the meditations that I have. So I'll go into something more recent that happened, and then we can do a proper altar tour. So, in December of 2022, I had to go for the last time to Italy to clear out, to save what needed to be saved from my old house, because my mother had accrued debt, and that probably would have been repossessed. So I was lucky enough that I still found things of my grandparents. So actually, this usually lives behind my grandparents' main picture. It's a bag of my grandmother. When I found it, it still had a comb with her hair. And get this, it had a veil. You know, it was proper when you go to mass or stuff like that to have a veil on your head. It's a show of modesty. So I didn't quite know what to do other than keeping it safe. When I consecrated the tarot, I decided that the tarot that I have for my grandparents is now gonna live in the veil. You can see the gold edges is inside, and then the deck lives inside of my grandmother's handbag. They still had, I think the last time that she must have used this was during Easter, because there are leaves, dried leaves of olive, which is something that you would get at Mass during Easter. So I think that's what happened. And along with it, there are like old documents, old pictures in it. I'm not going to show it because it's just very private, but yeah, I'm just going to tell you. Yeah, I feel very lucky to have found these things still. Something that actually, hey, thanatophobia, I mean to do is in my will to leave my possessions to a local museum, because museums do take inheritances happily of old things. So they might not be necessarily exhibited, but I know that they will be taken care of when I'm no longer around. And it's... I know that probably it's just important to me, so maybe not for that it would be relevant, but the simple fact probably that these things are this old now, that there are things here, there are pictures there that are over 100 years old. So if nothing else, it's because of how old they are that it might be worth preserving. So yeah, that's what I plan to do. Right, last thing. I do go to guided meditations and sound baths, or I used to. Now they don't do them anymore, unfortunately. I did the last one on the new moon a couple of weeks ago. I always hope to see my grandparents there. It hasn't quite happened. You might be thinking, are you just working with your two grandparents that you knew? And sort of, so far. What happened during this meditation? A lot happened during this meditation. But one of the things was seeing my grandparents, maternal, the ones that raised me, but also my grandparents from my father's side. I met my grandfather once when I was 3, but I never met my grandmother. Apparently I take from her in my hair. I kind of look like her, but I never met her. And I remember seeing them and seeing both of them, and going first, of course, to see my grandparents that raised me, but then going curiously to the other couple because I've never met them. And I kind of have concerns. Why? Because my grandparents from my father's side are Egyptian. And in the 1900s, and unfortunately up until now, as much as it's been made illegal, FGM, female genital mutilation, still has a pervasive presence up to 90% of population. So I won't go into detail here, but FGM is something cultural, perpetrated by the patriarchy, but actually enacted by the line of women in the family. Because my paternal grandmother was born in the early 1900s as well, it's statistically impossible that she wasn't subject to that, which also makes it really unlikely that she didn't subject her own daughters and her own granddaughters to it. And there's something that makes me very aware of the importance of asylum seekers finding asylums and being refugees from countries that are not even going through war is this kind of thing, is thinking, I was born in Italy by chance. My aunt was actually brought and kept in Egypt once she fell pregnant, so it could have happened to my mother as well. Had I been born there, would I have been subject to that at the hand of my grandmother? And as Frankie talks about what to do about bad ancestors, I don't quite know. That's the answer to that. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with my great-grandfather on my mother's side because he was beating his wife and his daughters. Would I want to deal with a woman that I know because of patriarchy, but it's a hard subject. And here I'm just talking about the personal side. I don't know if FGM will ever be a topic that there's a justification to discuss on this channel, but I have a lot of thoughts and opinions about that, of course. And genital mutilation in general, actually, like it's not just FGM, but anyway. So during this meditation, very briefly, all these thoughts came together. And so the thought came as to, well, you have a tarot deck that is Egyptian themed. I have the Egyptian Art Nouveau, which is such a problematic tarot deck. It's by the Scarabeo. It's made by Giulia Massaglia, which is the same artist that did the Golden Art Nouveau and the Mucca Tarot. And as an expert in Art Nouveau, she's not the best artist to have draw Art Nouveau. Antonella Castelli is so much better. I don't understand why the Scarabeo made that choice, but anyway, a bit of tea there. And she did recently the Egyptian Art Nouveau. Because it's Egyptian, because it's Art Nouveau, I wanted a copy, but I've done nothing with it, really. I haven't even done an interview spread. So while I was there, I had the thought of, well, technically you have that it's not Egyptian, but it's a reminder of actually the colonial eye with which we looked at Egypt from Victorian times. That's as close as we get, basically, to Egypt. Maybe you could dedicate that tarot deck to them, to do some good with it, because it's not something to be promoted otherwise. So I'm planning to do that. And realistically, what I plan to do is actually open again Ancestral Tarot, do the readings with tarot decks and see if now that it's been like a year and a half, things have changed and Ancestral Tarot suggests and agrees, and now I can do ancestral work according to its pattern rather than just being told, no, just pain will come out of this. So that's something that I plan to do. More recently even, something else happened. So my grandfather, the one that raised me, my maternal grandfather, had a nickname in the village. Everybody had a nickname in the village, really. And my grandfather, I don't know why, but I'm pretty certain it wasn't because he was a Latin lover or anything like that, was the cockerel. I think it was because he wasn't a drunkard or anything like that, but he always had red cheeks, which is something very funny because apparently people didn't expect me to be born half Egyptian, so darker of skin, but still having red cheeks. So what do you know? I had exactly that, because just is something, I don't know. Maybe we have rosacea in the family, I don't know. But yes, he was nicknamed the cockerel. A couple of months ago, in a charity shop here in Cardiff, I see all those statuettes that usually come from old people houses that have been donated. And one of those statuettes is indeed a cockerel. But it's in a little window, so I should ask people to actually take it out. I don't want to bother anyone. I just think about it and I'm like, if next time that I come here, you're still there, you're coming home with me, I'm gonna get you for my grandfather, in the name of my grandfather. And then, I don't know if you've seen, I think I made a reel on Instagram. Beverly Butterfly have made an amazing video about how to thrift objects for your witchcraft practice and your altar. Go watch it. It's amazing. I love it. I plan to do something similar soon. Like, let's build an altar from just charity shops. Anyway, because of that video, the next day I'm actually in town. I want to go to a charity shop. I accidentally go to this charity shop and I didn't remember that there was the cockerel, but I see it and I remember. So this time I'm like, fine, I'm taking the cockerel home. it gets, like, this is nothing, but it gets better. I'm coming home, and we actually have to go outside again with Raven. So the plan is just, I come home, I drop my bags, and then we go grocery shopping. We do that. I live basically at a three-way crossroad. Like, I'm almost at the corner of my road itself. So not quite at the three-way crossroad, but almost. We're crossing to go shopping, and on the opposite side of the crossroad, there's something between the electrical cabinets that there are around, and this something is an empty bottle of some liquor in the shape of a cockerel. Now, I don't know how it is for you, but I don't see cockerels that often in a line, one next to the other one. It's similar to the day that I found the key. Again, it's on Instagram. That day I went scouting in charity shops because I needed a key, I wanted a key. I had this call that I wanted a key. And then I find a rusted key, I get that key, and in the next charity shop that I go, I find a huge, humongous key that apparently you gift to people when they are 21. So the interesting thing is that when these weird things come to me and they're supposed to be signed, they always at least come in couple. So much like it happened with the key, which I suspect was Hecate, the double cockerel also felt like, yeah, no worries, I'm still there. Now maybe you want to know about my practice, so that's actually the thing, isn't it? So technically I should do tarot readings with them. I don't do them often enough. Accidentally, what I have fallen into is meditations, which is not my favorite way to interact with energy and spirits, because in my head I'm making it up. I take notes exactly to avoid thinking that, but it's very, very, very hard not to give in. And in a way, sometimes I question myself and I'm like, why do you just hear things that are neutral or positive? Why don't you hear about clearly the generational trauma that they have gone through? Because I cannot begin to imagine what it was like being a farmer in such a small village in Italy during World War I, during World War II. I don't know those stories. So clearly, my grandparents went through suffering. Why don't they talk to me about their suffering? I think that that's something that is real and should come true. And maybe they should tell me so that I can help heal all these sort of ancestral wounds, all these generational trauma. Why doesn't that stuff get communicated to me? So that's part of, I guess, my skepticism. But realistically, yeah, the main way that I've got the information that I got is through meditation so far. I don't do nearly enough tarot readings with them as I should. I've dedicated to them the relative tarot, which is all like vintage imagery and collages, which again, they are from the early 1900s, so it kind of makes sense. Most of the pictures on my altar, I'm lucky enough, they came from when I emptied the house in December of 2022. I had a couple of pictures of my grandparents with me already, so they were already out and I just kept those pictures, and I have a couple that I also carry with me. But the most of what you see here, it's actually what I salvaged in December of 2022, so I'm really lucky in that. And I go back to my great-grandparents. I have pictures of both my great-grandparents on my grandmother's side and on my grandfather's side, even if, again, I never met any of them. It was interesting to try and think that the first connection would be through the female line of my ancestors. Well, not necessarily, because like I also had this weird connection with my great-grandmother on my grandfather's side, but it was with his mother, not with his father. Peculiar, isn't it? One thing that I'll say is that I've heard people say that on your ancestor altar you don't keep pictures of people that are still currently alive. I have exceptions for that, which I can't say I've done anything bad so far, which is the pictures of my grandparents with me. So there are pictures of me as a child on my ancestor altar, and it works. It's the memories that I have of them. More often than not, I light them a tea light, and usually I ask my nonna, my nonno, and all my ancestral line who wants to help to bring me protection, to help me with like little trouble that I have, especially when it's connected to Italy, because, you know, they're there, they're local there. Hopefully they can help. I've come to call upon them during my spell work as well, so other than, you know, calling the quarters, calling my deities, I tend to call my grandparents as well, at the very least. I guess there's a natural connection because I was around them, I knew them in the immanent world. But I would like to go further back. Alas, I have this trouble about self-doubt. Am I making this up? Which makes it harder to concede to things and people that I didn't know in real 3D life. But it's interesting that at the very least there's been the poking of my great-grandmothers. I really like that. I really wish that my village would reply and have the patience to go into the archives and check, what did my great-grandmother die of? How many siblings did she have? Because if by any chance this is correct, that would be kind of revolutionary for me. I am rubbish with pendulums. Pendulums don't seem to want to work with me. It's really, really weird. The one time that stuck with me, probably because the pendulum told me what I wanted to hear, was after the meditation that I did and I saw my great-grandmothers. I took the pendulum, which is made of amethyst, that I keep in front of my further away in time ancestors, so in front of my great-grandparents. And it comes from the Ancestral Magic kit from Nancy Hendrickson as well. But again, I don't work with pendulums, so I just left it there. After that meditation, I just asked the pendulum the basic yes or no, and this time it was actually moving. Not much, but it was kind of moving. They usually don't move at all with me. And the one question that I asked was, is my great-grandmother here? And it said yes. And then I just started to cry. So I don't know if I didn't ask any other question to check or verify. Something that I can say as someone that doesn't have a good relationship with their family members who are still alive is that for someone that doesn't speak to their own parents, ancestral work is really important for me. I care a lot about it. Beside the thanatophobia and, you know, the kind of certainty that it would be, it's just because my parents are the outliers. Like, fair enough, I don't know enough about my father's family, but in my mother's family, my mother was the outlier. My grandparents were good people. I know that there's this belief that, you know, hurt people, stuff like that. The hurt of my mother, though, never came from her parents. At most, she was hurt by the fact that they were farmers, so they were poor. And she had to work the fields from a relatively young age. And by relatively, I mean 14, 15, which is really, really young. But the resentment that this fostered to turn her into the person that she is now, and the things that she has done to me. The vision that she has of things is just of possessions. People are possessions as well. And I can understand with a lot of effort the idea that, oh, if you are poor and have nothing, then you exceed on the other side. But there are ways to do it as the King of Pentacles, my grandfather, and there are ways to do it that feel like the reversed Queen of Pentacles, which is my mother. The hoarding, the need to control people, the need to manipulate people. No. So, to me, it's very reassuring, it's very healing to know that despite my mother, I come from people that I loved and that did love me. You know, when you come from trauma and lack of love from your own parents, there's you know, that can make a person turn bad. And I think the reason why I didn't is because of my grandparents. So that is something that is very, very precious to me. The fact that I haven't turned bitter, the fact that I haven't turned with stronger PTSD than I do with other mental health issues is likely because I wasn't completely deprived of adult that I could rely upon, because if my mother was that, if my father was just not around, my grandparents were always there. My grandparents never made me doubt for a second that they loved me. And for someone that comes from my background, it's unusual. And I genuinely think it's the reason why I've always had, despite the treatment that the world gave me, this naive belief that I'm a good person, I deserve love, I just need to find my people. Which, with my experiences, everybody agrees, my therapists agree, I shouldn't have. This is very naive of a belief to have when every social experience told me differently. Every single one apart from my grandparents. And so that's why ancestral work is important to me, because these are the people that allowed me not to grow into a person that would have been much less positive for the world. I hope this was useful. Not too much of a downer. And if you have any questions, if you'd like me to explore other sides, other parts of my ancestral work, please do let me know. I love to talk about my ancestors. Hopefully I will get into shape and do more actual practical work. Let's try and get back into the ancestral tarot part, if it finally accepts me. Basically, my hopes for the future are not being able to question if something happens. If I talk to my grandparents in a meditation, I just know. I want to know. And until next time, I hope that we can hex the patriarchy together, because there's clearly a fuck ton of need for it.